B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Monday, February 25th, 2019. Over the weekend, I popped in occasionally to watch CNN as they hyped the coverage and offered CIA-approved propaganda live from the borders of Venezuela and its neighboring nations, Brazil and Colombia. And the corporate media coverage is atrocious. They are lying to us. They are fudging the facts and fudging the timelines to try to present the picture that there is a huge clash at those border points. Here's a headline in my San Francisco Chronicle based on an Associated Press story. Clashes over aid shipment erupt at tense border. Now, this was an organized confrontation. And it is treated by the media in this country as, gosh, look at these people, these activists who are demanding that humanitarian aid be able to cross into Venezuela. And as I've pointed out, these aid convoys or caravans are Trojan horses. They got a few boxes in tractor-trailer rigs, but it's all about the imagery, about the optics. And I reported to you on Friday that 2 members of an indigenous tribe had been killed at a border crossing between Brazil and Colombia. Brazil and Venezuela. And that gets rolled up into the weekend coverage to create this New York Times headline in the Sunday paper. Deadly clashes erupt along Venezuela's borders as aid trickles in. Now again, these are events that are being fudged together to create the impression, the perception, the illusion that there is violence there and that it's Maduro's fault. And today, from the corporate media, Mike Pence, the vice president, is in Bogota, Colombia, where he is doling out new sanctions on targeted governors of Venezuela and American cash to the rump government, the illegitimate claimed Guaido government. $56 million new dollars from America have been pledged to Guaido. And with stern face, Pence said, I want to assure you, he called him President Guaido, that the tragic events of the past weekend have only steeled the resolve of the United States of America. We are with you 100%. And here's how the New York Times reports it. The opposition's ambitious plan to deliver badly needed humanitarian aid inside the country ended in just one truck making it across the Colombian border by Saturday, the opposition's self-imposed deadline for the end of a blockade established by Maduro. Confrontations between opposition protesters and government forces devolved into violence. And, in a moment, we'll get you some accurate coverage about that devolution into violence from Max Blumenthal, who is actually in Venezuela. One more quote from the Times. Last week, in preparation for the attempted aid delivery, Guaido slipped across the border into Colombia, defying a travel ban imposed by the Venezuelan courts. Guaido was expected to meet with Pence today. It was unclear when or even if Guaido would be allowed to return to Venezuela. So he may have, in an effort to be part of the photo opportunity, he may have locked himself out of the country where he's trying to stage a coup. That would be inconvenient, wouldn't it? And hey, a voice has surfaced, a Democrat in the United States Senate, as reported by the Times. Christopher Murphy, Democrat of Connecticut, accused the administration of using the delivery of humanitarian aid as a red herring to bring about regime change. He's right. And this is a rare, honest statement from a Democrat. The rest of them are enabling Trump's regime change scheme here. Murphy went on in a tweet, Venezuela didn't just lurch into humanitarian crisis. The aid is being sent there now as part of a regime change strategy. Many are hoping that it will be the match that lights a civil war against Maduro. That's exactly what Trump and Pence and most of the Democratic leaders are hoping for. They want it to occur without any direct blame on the United States. But I believe that Trump and his allies are willing to light that fuse if that's what it takes. Now, one of the most important things that Max Blumenthal opens his report from Caracas, it's available today at consortiumnews.com, and I didn't check, but probably also at his page at grayzoneproject.com. He writes, the Trump administration's coup against Venezuela culminated on February 23, that's Saturday, with U.S.-backed opposition attempting to ram several trucks loaded with boxes of USAID, quote, humanitarian aid, end quote, across the previously unused Francisco de Paula Santander Bridge, connecting Colombia to Venezuela. And they never put in the picture captions or when the B-roll flashes by on TV that this bridge has never been opened to traffic between Colombia and Venezuela. But because there are a couple of tractor-trailer rigs and I guess a tanker that are used to fortify the blockade there, this is designated or described as something that Maduro did recently. And it is flatly false. But it makes for a good picture, doesn't it? It looks like a blockade. And Blumenthal quotes a right-wing Venezuelan activist, Father Sergio Munoz, who is on the Colombian side of the border. He said the humanitarian aid was purely symbolic, a provocation aimed at discrediting Venezuelan President Maduro in international eyes and generating waves of destabilizing violence. Yes, indeed. But the happy anchors, what was her name? Frederica something on CNN yesterday. Oh, they don't bother to mention any of that stuff. And then one of the trailers that did not make it across the Santander Bridge was lit on fire on the Colombian side of the border. And Blumenthal reports that this was the work not of the uniformed guards of the National Guard of Venezuela, but what are called guarimberos. And these are the right-wing opposition, kind of the black bloc of those who are trying to take out Maduro. And he writes, on the Santander Bridge Saturday, the guarimbos rained down a hail of rocks and Molotov cocktails on Venezuelan National Guardsmen holding the line against these trucks. Suddenly, the trucks caught fire, and the massed youth began unloading boxes of aid before they burned. Within minutes, pro-opposition media reported that the Venezuelan National Guard forces were responsible for the fires. Then it was blamed on the tear gas that was lobbed by the Venezuelans to disperse the crowd, and Blumenthal declares that absurd on its face. I personally witnessed tear gas canisters hit every kind of vehicle in the Palestinian West Bank, and they have never caused a vehicle fire. And he says, by blaming the Venezuelan government for burning the trucks, Marco Rubio is attempting to establish the casus belli, the cause for war, that he has been seeking. And Rubio put up a tweet. They may not realize it yet, but today the Maduro regime made it easier to isolate them internationally. After today, it'll be difficult for nations to remain neutral. So, they simply created pictures. Then they wrote the captions for those pictures in a propagandistic and clearly biased way. And then they say, see, Maduro is evil, he's got to go. Mike Pompeo declares his days are numbered. And Blumenthal also reports that the International Red Cross is bitterly upset that some of the Venezuelan opposition activists adopted Red Cross branding or markings. They used the symbol of the Red Cross on one of those trucks. And the Red Cross is having no part of this obviously politicized and phony humanitarian effort. And when you see them faking Red Cross Is that because there aren't any white helmets available in Venezuela? Over at Shadowproof, Kevin Gostola adds to the picture in a number of ways. He confirms that the Molotov cocktails that were lobbed at the trucks came from Venezuelan opposition members and not from the armed National Guard. And he also says that last week, over 900 tons of food and medicine were delivered at a Venezuelan port in La Guaira. The aid came from China, Cuba, India, Turkey, and Russia separately delivered 300 tons of medicine and medical supplies. So the idea that Maduro is trying to starve his people and destroy the healthcare system so they just die, I think that is demonstrably false. And a good report coming from a Canadian journalist named Matthew J.L. Arrett reveals, at least to me, the outsized role that Canada is playing in this regime change effort in Venezuela. And Chrystia Freeland, who is the foreign minister of Canada, has been, the article says, at the forefront of every attempt to preserve the structures of the failing Anglo-American empire, including playing a guiding role behind the regime change, direct democracy movement now tearing apart Venezuela. And he quotes a news report from January. Playing a key role behind the scenes was Lima Group member Canada, whose foreign minister, Chrystia Freeland, spoke to Guaido the night before Maduro's swearing-in ceremony to offer her government support should he confront the socialist leader. And then we find out that the Lima Group, which is 14 Latin American nations and 11 of them support the change of the guard in Venezuela. Well, Canada is not only a member, it was a founder of the Lima Group. And I believe its sole focus is getting rid of Maduro. So I think it's a worthy read. I've linked to it in the show file for today's podcast. Also at Common Dreams, Adam Johnson writes, no one actually thinks that the murderer's row of cold warriors, led by two of the most extreme right-wingers in American politics, Elliott Abrams and John Bolton, cares at all about the starving people in Venezuela or their plight. No one reading this, be they right, left, center, libertarian, or communist, actually buys the prevailing narrative that the U.S. is sending aid to Venezuela as a humanitarian gesture. And I think he has some other interesting comments, not all of which I agree with. Then over at Truthdig, I want to recommend Lee Camp, the comedian, satirist, and a guy who can supply your daily adult minimum dose of irony. Well, he said, he opens the piece, there are three things I know for sure in this world. You will never have a safety pin when you need one. You will have thousands when you don't. Wild animals are breathtakingly majestic until they're crawling up your pant leg. And a U.S. presidential administration will never admit that it invaded another country or backed a coup attempt in order to essentially steal the natural resources of said country. He says that's why it's so very shocking when members of the Trump administration did just that. And he says the three criteria for regime change in this case are a socialist government that wants to drop the dollar as the basis of its trade, and it possesses vast natural resources. I've linked to Lee Camp's piece, too, and you can read it for yourselves over at truthdig.com. Over the weekend, Bernie Sanders disappointed many of his supporters by tweeting a comment that really fudges what his position is on regime change in Venezuela. Now, he has been very clear that he opposes the use of military force, that he does believe in self-determination for the people of Venezuela. But this tweet raised a lot of eyebrows, including those of the, she's got pretty nice eyebrows, Abby Martin. Bernie Sanders tweeted, the people of Venezuela are enduring a serious humanitarian crisis. The Maduro government must put the needs of its people first, allow humanitarian aid into the country, and refrain from violence against protesters. Now, by embracing the line here, allow humanitarian aid into the country, that is a Trump CIA talking point. That's a John Bolton, Elliott Abrams comment. And Abby Martin called him out. You know better than to endorse a stunt led by war criminals who have snuck weapons in aid shipments in the past. This stance will not make Democrats like you more and will only lose your support from socialists. And this occurs against the backdrop. There was an Atlantic article, I think, published on Friday that was saying, hey, Bernie Sanders, who is facing competition from others running for president who say Me Too to the $15 minimum wage and Me Too to universal health care, Medicare for all, that he is trying to distinguish himself by developing more foreign policy positions that are progressive and more progressive from the Democratic center. And so this is a huge step back from what I had thought was some important growth on the part of candidate Bernie Sanders. American-based corporate media is just catching up with a big story that broke in Israel last week, and that is that Benjamin Netanyahu, in a desperate attempt to stave off the investigations and win re-election in April, has made a deal with the furthest right elements of the political scene in Israel. He has engineered an alliance with the party called Otzma Yehudit, which in English is Jewish Power, and that is the party that was started by Meir Kahane, a Brooklyn-born, fiery Zionist extremist who counseled murder and racist epithets on many occasions. And the Times writes it this way: Netanyahu, his future imperiled by prosecutors and political challengers alike, has enraged Jewish leaders in Israel and the United States by striking a bargain with a racist anti-Arab party whose ideology was likened by one influential rabbi to Nazism. And what is astounding here is that AIPAC has diplomatically and deftly separated itself from this move by Netanyahu. And that is shocking, friends. I've been commenting a lot about AIPAC, following the comments that were tweeted by Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and twisted into these fanciful claims of anti-Semitism. But when AIPAC is fighting the extremist leader of Israel, it's hard to know who to cheer for. So the tweet that came from AIPAC expressed its agreement with the American Jewish Committee, and the American Jewish Committee said that it was deeply troubled by this new alliance with the party of Meir Kahane. And we go to Haaretz, the liberal paper in Jerusalem, where they report that Netanyahu took to Facebook in Hebrew on Saturday night and accused the left of hypocrisy and double standards. Quote, they denounce a bloc on the right with right-wing parties, while the left has acted to put extremist Islamists into the Knesset to create a bloc that would overtake the right. Now, this is neener stuff that probably doesn't mean much to those of us who don't understand the myriad parties in Israeli politics. But the American Jewish Congress wrote, the views of this party are reprehensible. They do not reflect the core values that are the very foundation of the State of Israel. And then AIPAC just said, we agree with AJC. AIPAC has a long-standing policy not to meet with members of this racist and reprehensible party. But get this. Netanyahu is going to be speaking to the AIPAC annual conference in Washington next month. So they don't object too much. And once again, they're going to create a platform for Netanyahu to campaign for office in Israel from right here in good old America. And Marjorie Cohn warns, based on the actions going on in Venezuela and the border countries right now, that the Trump administration is threatening to unleash a flood of lawsuits involving Cuba. And she notes that at the beginning of the year, Trump made a point of renewing a waiver of Title III. And you don't need to know what Title III is. It is a part of the Helms-Burton law. And going back as far as Bill Clinton, the U.S. has waived this Title III every 6 months. The Trump administration did that for the first year and a half, but on January 16th, they waived it for only 45 days until March 17th. And that could be the trigger for hefty new sanctions on Cuba, which hasn't done anything to deserve any angry response from the United States. It is only to pander to Marco Rubio and the expat community in Miami. So Trump announced today that he is pushing back his own deadline to increase tariffs on China. Trump tweeted that he will delay a Friday deadline to increase tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese imports. And this just shows how whimsical, how arbitrary Trump is with these sanctions and tariffs and efforts to try to, force other countries to conform to his will. And as you may know, I'm not opposed to all tariffs. I also believe that China has been a huge violator of intellectual property rights. But Trump's reckless approach to essentially declaring war on all of our trading partners at the same time, and then just, arbitrarily saying, well, we can let this wait for a little bit. I just think that it brings instability to world markets. We have pushed China into a recession, which hurts the U.S. economy and companies that sell products in China, starting with Apple. And I do not support this really emotional and unpredictable approach to these negotiations. Trump's not tweeting about this. After his tweet in December that all American troops are coming out of Syria because ISIS has been defeated, well, in his latest reversal, he has agreed to leave 400 troops in Syria, 200 in a multinational force in the northeast, and 200 at a small outpost in the southeast. This is in response to demands from allies who said they'd pull all their troops out too. And it's just ridiculous. We don't have a basis to be in Syria to begin with, and having pockets of troops, 200 here, 200 there, I think makes them targets. And this is an incoherent strategy, and it always has been. Britain's Labour Party has finally announced that it supports a second referendum on withdrawal from the European Union, or Brexit 2.0. And I don't understand all of the vagaries of the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn, who has been a long opponent of the European Union and Britain's involvement in it. But he has been content to let Theresa May twist in the wind and lose parliamentary votes and see Britain lose face as she begs for renegotiation of the Brexit deal. And so there have been people who defected from the Labour Party, some amid what I consider to be false claims of anti-Semitism. And as a result, he has announced that he will promote the idea of a second vote. That's still a non-starter for Theresa May, but we'll see where that goes. Every day I pause for a moment to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like Faith Peoples. I don't know how many Peoples. I don't know how many subscriptions Faith Peoples has. And I worried there that the S on Peoples means I should have had have. But her name is singular, not plural. Also, Paul Tomaselli, Johnny Jump, Ethan Knox. They all kick in $5, $10 a month to support my work, and you can do it too. That's how I pay the bills here. You notice we don't have any corporate advertising, any advertising at all. So, all you got to do is visit peterbcollins.com. You click on the menu tab, then click on Become a Subscriber. You get to the sign-up page, and from there, you can make your choices, $5, $10, $20 a month. Or, if you act now, take out a new annual subscription and give me a mailing address in the continental U.S. I've got a bonus book for you. It's Dr. Justin A. Frank's latest book called Trump on the Couch, and I'd love to send you a copy. So I want to recommend, if you have seen the Best Picture, according to the Oscars, Green Book, Well, you are clear then to listen to one of my latest podcasts that went up Friday at whowhatwhy.org. And there we talk about Green Book in great detail, so I don't want to spoil the film for you. But my guest for that podcast is Dr. Wilmer Leon, who spoke to members of the family of Don Shirley, the African-American jazz pianist, who was played by Mahershala Ali. And Ali won the Best Supporting Actor Oscar for his work in the film. But the only person, and the film got several awards, the only person who thanked or even mentioned Don Shirley was Ali. Peter Farrelly and Nick Vallelonga, who co-wrote the screenplay, made no apologies or even any reference to how far the film goes astray from the life story of Don Shirley. They introduce themes and incidents and characteristics that are not at all part of the real story of Don Shirley. And it has produced complaints and a backlash. I encourage you to listen to the podcast. There's a link to it in the show file for this podcast at peterbcollins.com. And Green Book disappointed many because they were expecting Roma to win. And Roma is an interesting film. It is set in Mexico City in the early 1970s. And the cinematography in black and white was spectacular. I found the film to be long and hard to watch because the plot evolves so slowly. There's a lot of attention to the detail of the daily life of a housekeeper in a wealthy Mexican family. And I just, part of the impression I have is that the night before, on Friday, we watched Capernaum, which is set in the slums of Beirut, and it follows the life of a preteen boy. He's 12 or 13 at the time, and his name is Zane. And Zane has remarkable life coping skills in a very difficult situation. And I found it to be a fascinating film, and for my money, a better picture than Roma. Now, enough of the Oscars and films. Let's talk about what went on in Roma, Italia last week. The Pope Francis convened a convocation about sex abuse and cover-up in the Catholic Church. And primarily it was just more words. The victims of priestly abuse were deeply disappointed with this conference. The only thing that I see that came out of it is a policy change that offending priests will be handed off to secular authorities. So they're going to call the cops when somebody accuses a priest of violating somebody's sexual privacy. And I think that is a substantive change. But by and large, nothing else significant came out of the meeting, and Pope Francis really has a mess on his hands. Once again, I believe that to avoid a schism and to preserve what's left of the Roman Catholic Church, that they should require all of the American bishops to resign. One of the stories that went viral in social media over the weekend is a video of a meeting that California Senator Dianne Feinstein had with a group of students from an operation called the Sunrise Movement. And they were lobbying her to support the Green New Deal. And I felt she was quite condescending to them. And when one of the students said, "We voted for you because," she said, "Well, how old are you?" And the kid said 16. And so she said, "Well, you didn't vote for me. You can't vote." And that is a point that is accurate, but not very diplomatic. And I believe that Feinstein showed how out of touch she is, and she didn't have to embrace every element of the Green New Deal. She certainly could have met them at their aspirations, but she chose to be a schoolmarm. And many of those same protesters marched over to Mitch McConnell's office at the Senate complex today, and they got arrested, protesting as they tried to get a message to him. And this is where I think maybe they don't understand the system, because Mitch McConnell is about to bring an early vote on the Senate floor about the Green New Deal in an effort to kill it. And I'm not sure they're totally aware of the machinations of the bill mill that we call the United States Senate. A federal judge, has ruled that it is now discriminatory to exclude women from the military draft. Now, we don't have a draft operating right now, but if we did, because women are now allowed to serve in combat, they will be required to register for and participate in a draft if it is reinstated in the future. Want to say a fond farewell and happy trails to Ken Nordine. Ken and I were neighbors who never met in Evanston, Illinois. While I was working in radio in Chicago, he was making recordings that he called word jazz. And I consider Ken Nordine to be an inimitable talent. Really, there is nobody who had his skills. He died over the weekend at the age of 98 in Chicago. Actually, he died before that. February 16th is the reported day that he died. And I don't know if YouTube is going to kick out this podcast because I want to play a little word jazz for you. This is from an episode called The Vidiot.
Tonight I have a friend with me here who is hooked on TV. Jim, when did you first contract the TV habit?
3 years ago, Ken, I became a Vidiot.
A Vidiot? Is this a term that I don't understand too much about being...
Well, that's what we people call ourselves.
Vidiots.
Yeah.
Well, how did this happen? How did you get into this terrible situation that has torn your soul so far apart?
Oh, it was when I started watching Milton Berle.
Milton Berle.
Well,
Milton Berle was on TV back early in the 1950s, so that kind of dates this particular segment of word jazz. But go to YouTube and just enter Ken Nordine, Nordine, and there is a wealth of his work that you can enjoy. I got to interview Ken once when he came to San Francisco to perform, and he was a real gentleman, quite humble, and had a great sense of humor. He certainly will be missed. And another obituary that is on my desk today is for Jeff Adachi. He was a 5-term public defender here in San Francisco, and he was courageous and relentless in fighting for the people who were covered by his office. And most recently, he championed the case of Jose Garcia Zarate, the man accused of murdering Kate Steinle. And that case was piled onto, demagogued by Trump, by local officials. And he and his team, led by Matt Gonzalez, did an incredible job under very difficult circumstances, and they won that case, persuading the jury that it was an accidental discharge of a firearm and not some sort of a gun violence crime that was in the case before them. So Jeff Adachi made a great contribution to San Francisco and to people in the criminal justice system, and he will definitely be missed. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it far and wide. You'll find it on YouTube unless they bounce it today. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.